A few months ago, I made the decision to review the first episode of The Flash Season 9. In that video, I said I'm going to be reviewing every individual episode before finally reviewing the season as a whole. This series of videos became much bigger and more successful than I expected, prompting me to make individual arc reviews as well as like top 10 lists and rankings that I might not have done otherwise, or at least not as many. Thank you everyone for watching and caring about my opinion for some reason, but now it's time to fulfill my initial promise. Now that it's been over 2 weeks since the show ended, and I've had enough time to digest everything, this video will be my review of The Flash Season 9, a season that began on February 8th, 2023 and ended on May 23rd, 2023, and consists of 13 episodes split into 3 portions, an arc called Rogue War, an arc called A New World, and an interlude in between. My ratings for the 13 individual episodes are as seen on screen, although I feel like I was a bit too lenient on episode 3, which I'd lower to a 6, which leaves the season with an average of an embarrassing 4.3 out of 10, helped quite a bit by episodes 9 and 10, but not helped at all by the 2 worst episodes in this show's history in a row, followed a couple episodes later by the 3rd worst episode. That being said, while the average is a 4.3 or around that number, I think the season itself deserves an even lower rating, because just like how I talked about the Red Death arc in that review being lesser than the sum of its parts, that's true for Season 9 as well. The best episodes are mostly completely standalone, the story arcs are terribly paced, and the season itself is stupidly structured. I'll get to the final rating of the season at the end of the video, but this brings us to the review itself, in which I'll try to be a little bit less specific than my episodic or even arc reviews, as there are a lot more episodes to review at once. And with that in mind, make sure to subscribe and like this video, and let's begin with the first section of the review, which is going to be covering the writing/storytelling. Season 9 is simply chock full of bad dialogue, including people not speaking like real people or speaking in the cheesiest kinds of cliches. Villains come off as much more cartoonishly evil and not having any complexity at all. The side characters fall completely flat. Probably the Flash would as well, he's just saved by Grant Gustin's performance. It causes the world to feel more cartoony and less real and harder to get invested in when it's cartoony but not a cartoon, and this causes some scenes that are very difficult to sit through, such as Red Death's Batman references, any moment involving background characters, especially the one in the bar, or even in fight scenes where the 2 combatants are throwing the stupidest lines at each other. The dialogue in this season, and basically in the entirety of the Eric Wallace era of The Flash, is awful. The seasonal structure of Season 9 is so bafflingly poorly planned out, as they are given just 13 episodes, which is less than ever, but they could have used this shorter amount of time to tell a more tight story, maybe break it up into 2 arcs, and that's technically what they did, but there's a 3rd block in the middle, which it did not have the room for. Dedicating 4 episodes to filler in a 13 episode long storyline is so stupid. 3 out of 4 of these episodes do not accomplish or contribute anything to anyone. I mean, Cecile's story was just repeated later on, Dreamer's story was created for that episode, and Iris and Barry's episode literally didn't do anything. Only one of the filler episodes isn't completely skippable, and that's because it's arguably not filler, it's the final crossover episode with Arrow. Technically, Dreamer's episode is the final crossover with Supergirl, but Dreamer has no connection to anyone from The Flash. This 4 episode filler block would be far easier to forgive if there weren't only 4 episodes left in the season, leaving the final arc with the same amount of episodes they dedicated to filler. So basically, this final arc was doomed from the start. The stories themselves are abysmally developed stories with horrible pacing, like Cobalt Blue taking 3 episodes to develop, but then only being the villain for like half of 1 episode, and also many unresolved questions, like where was Batwoman? A huge plot point brought up in episode 3 was that Ryan Wilder was missing, which was how Red Death was even able to attempt to trick Iris into thinking that she had escaped, and how Team Flash was able to put things together. But then in episode 5, Batwoman just shows up, leaves no explanation for where she was or why she was missing, and then just leaves. Did they forget about this plot line that they themselves brought up 2 episodes prior? It's so stupid. The writing of these stories, the stories themselves, they're so poorly planned out, they're so poorly thought up in advance, which is crazy because they're so short. It should be so easy. How did they make these 23 episode long, season long storylines back in the day, but now they're failing at just 4 or 5 episodes being coherent? The writing also makes the show feel like it's being purposely made for children, as the show constantly talks down to the audience, which not even kids shows should do, with nearly constant and poorly placed flashbacks and Cecile explaining the character's emotions. So for one, we can't remember anything that ever happened on this show, and another, we can't understand the nuances of implied emotion on characters. The latter is a more annoying problem, but the former was far more persistent in this particular season as opposed to previous ones. Season 9's visuals are mostly as bad as the previous few seasons, but can be either better or worse depending on the specific type of visual. For instance, the cinematography is indeed mostly really bad, but the season is carried visually by Flash's suit, although there are 3 episodes in a row where we don't see it. But the suit was perfected with the addition of the golden boots in the last season, the occasional nice coloring which complements the suit, and a more cinematic aspect ratio, which was a nice change that definitely makes Season 9 look better, but might have come a bit too late. The fact that there are 171 episodes with one specific aspect ratio, and then another 13 with a different one, I feel like would create a mild disconnect between Season 9 and the rest of the show, which does sound like it'd be jarring on a rewatch binge. However, maybe the plummeting quality would be a bit more jarring, or something that people would notice. What is arguably worse than ever is the fight scenes. The quote-unquote good ones, which are the speedster fights, are far too short and focus too heavily on lightning constructs, although Flash vs. Red Death uses lightning constructs far more interestingly than ever, as Red Death uses them as Batman gadgets. Alongside that fight, Flash vs. Kid Flash and Flash vs. XS are highlights, despite none of them actually being great and all of them being too short. Also, you could maybe add in there Green Arrow's fight in episode 9, although I don't think that fight was up to the standard that Arrow had in its fight scenes for the entirety of its run, aside from season 4, which for some reason had bad fight scenes. I don't know why. The bad fight scenes are far more prevalent, as there's a lot of non-speedsters fighting speedsters, which in this show, in this season specifically, is never interesting. It always looks cheap and poorly choreographed, with some lowlights including Red Death fighting the Rogues, Cecile fighting XS, if you could even call that a fight scene, and especially in the finale, fight scenes like Allegra vs. Reverse Flash, Keon vs. Zoom, and especially Cecile fighting Godspeed, which is the worst fight in the show's history, and all of them are embarrassingly pathetic. It's all enhanced as well by this season's mostly terrible CGI. That is probably the reason for why the speedster fights are so short. The CGI is really bad in this season, especially again for some reason in the finale. They might have spent all the CGI budget on episode 9, as Bloodwork doesn't just look great, but looks better than he did in season 6, much nicer colors and movements. He is, however, an outlier in this season. Barry is inconsistent as usual, maybe even more so. He's great some of the time, like when he puts together the mystery of the Red Death, or when he beat the Reverse Flash in episode 10 as the show went full circle. However, more often than not in this season, he is jobbed pretty hard, losing fights to much less powerful enemies or less experienced speedsters while needing to be saved by his friends or have his friends come up with how to defeat the villains. Barry really doesn't have an overarching story this season either. He's kind of just going along for the ride, while having contained arcs in specific episodes. Not only that, but Flash is also not the focus of every episode, as around a third of the season barely even features him, which is embarrassing for the final season. Grant Gustin's performance and Flash's suit are great, but the writing of the character is so inconsistent that the character himself, while still the best of the season, is not very good as a character most of the time. Iris was one of, if not the single most hated character on the show at one point, but at this point looks amazing in comparison to almost everyone else. She's mostly a reporter in the season, which is good, and the few episodes we see her with Barry, I think they land, and I think their chemistry has genuinely improved. Iris is, however, sidelined for most of the season, only really getting focused in like 3 episodes. Candace Patton does a good job this season, especially in her interactions with Barry, but Iris simply isn't given anywhere near enough to do. Joe pretty much doesn't do anything in the season aside from being a plot device in Cecile's story, leading into him leaving the show, which would have been emotional in an earlier season, but he leaves in the 8th to last ever episode and then returns for a few of those episodes, so it rings pretty hollow. Also, the fact that his storyline is as intertwined with Cecile's in this season makes him not a great character to see on screen because it's always with Cecile. Cecile is easily the worst character on this show. Her powers actively detract from the viewing experience, like I mentioned earlier, as they talk down to us. And unlike Barry Allen, Cecile has this overarching story that drags until the second to last episode where she struggles with her responsibilities as a hero, colliding with her responsibilities as a mother and a wife. The first arc drags this story along in a way that feels like it's just retreading tired grounds again and again, and the conclusion they reach with Cecile deciding to stay on Team Flash and then visit Jo and her daughter, Jenna, on the weekends is so stupid and so irresponsible, and this leads into two separate episodes focusing on Cecile doubting this decision, something she should do, until she's gaslit by Allegra and then by Chester into thinking that it's all okay and that it was the right decision. In both of these episodes, it's treated like she overcame some doubts and now she's more confident than ever and unlocks a new ability. This story isn't just bad, it's actively damaging, preaching that it doesn't matter how much time you spend with your family as long as you love them, which is an objectively wrong, morally reprehensible, and super random lesson to write a story around. What is this? Why are they doing this? Additionally, Cecile becoming a different hero named Virtue as a 75-year-old woman in 2049, but then having that costume in the present day while also unlocking two never-before-seen powers 2 episodes in a row at the end of the season, while also being the focus of the final scene before the final Flash logo ever. It's crazy to me. Clearly, Eric Wallace has some sort of obsession with Cecile Horton, maybe the actress who plays Cecile Horton. Season 9 of The Flash is genuinely not about The Flash, it's about Cecile. There's a lot of jokes about how this show in the past was the Iris, or maybe Arrow became a Felicity show, but genuinely, Barry does not have a story in Season 9. Cecile has a story in Season 9. However, there is also another character who gives Cecile a run for her money who does also have a story. Keon is a third personality of Caitlyn's who's a completely original character who's introduced in the very last season, robbing Caitlyn of her own presence in this season, replacing her with this annoyingly naive, childlike being who also sometimes says the wisest thing ever, a trope that is so weird and I've always hated. Her story of connected to Chillblaine is completely skippable, her developing powers feel pointless, and the fact that they're technically not pointless, but this character added at the last second ends up being an actual goddess who has a bigger importance to this universe than the Flash himself is insulting to this show. Worst of all, this character's story is just disturbing. Caitlyn dies and for some reason no one cares. The team has this super unsettling vote deciding who to bring back between Caitlyn and Frost, but it's a vote between 5 people who are all given an equal vote despite one being a murderer, and yet Caitlyn's mom, maybe Cisco Ramon, and other former members of Team Flash, or people who are close to Caitlyn, maybe even people who are close to Frost, don't get a vote. It's so messed up. As is the reveal at the end that Caitlyn's been alive this entire time, implying that Keon kind of just possessed her body for a year, using it to metamorphosize into a goddess, which also explains why nobody reacted to the fact that Caitlyn's dead, because the writers knew that she wasn't dead, so obviously that means the character know that as well. Everything about Keon's existence, her character, and her story is perplexingly bad. The character of Keon and then Cecile in Season 9 are the two worst any character has ever been on this show. Chester and Allegra don't really do anything that doesn't relate to each other. It's like they've molded together into one entity, which is completely defined by their relationship. It can be argued that that's a good thing because instead of 2 bad characters, we now have 1 net positive. And yeah, sure, we could look at it that way, but regardless, this is a character who is a waste of space and only exists to either be blatant Nepo character bias or maybe a self-insert. The actors do a good enough job. The acting is not the problem here, it's the writing and the character's existence. Chillblaine being up the series regular is a baffling decision. At the beginning, he's obsessed over Frost and trying to bring her back, which is uninteresting. Then there's the twist of him going to Red Death's side. That was cool, but then they kind of revert to the usual Chillblaine the very next episode, so that faded pretty quickly, and his story becomes about falling in love with Keon, which is so ridiculously uninteresting. It seems to me that the writers also noticed that there's not much mileage in making Chillblaine a series regular, and that it was a mistake, because he kind of just leaves for 4 episodes, almost a third of the season where he is not present, and then comes back just to do absolutely nothing. John Cora is actually a pretty good actor, and he's being completely wasted on the awful dialogue and the awful character he's given on this show. The good rogues in the Red Death arc are fun characters with entertaining interactions with each other, or even Barry or other members of Team Flash, and a well-handled sort of halfway redemption arc. Without fully redeeming them, they're kind of like anti-heroes at the end. They do have some very cringy dialogue and very bad fight scenes, but at least they are entertaining in their interactions. The bad rogues are all very cheesy and poorly refined, as their motivations aren't clear and they are all derivative of villains from the past. The best of them is easily Captain Boomerang, as Season 9 finally allows one of Flash's most iconic rogues to be a Flash villain, complete with a great adaptation of the design. Beyond that surface level achievement, these villains are not good. Neither is the Red Death, their leader, who starts off threatening but quickly unthreatens herself by unmasking herself and beginning to constantly drop bat lines, in addition to genuinely horrendous acting and bad dialogue that makes for a child throwing a tantrum of a main villain, complete with a butchered and far less interesting origin that we don't even see, a bad suit that's far too dark and bulky, movements that are clunky and undercooked motivation, poor rivalry with Barry, and an incomplete plot. Red Death is one of the show's worst villains. Whoever the villains of episodes 6 and 7 were, I do not remember. They are that forgettable. The villain of episode 8 has a good comic booky design, but literally doesn't do anything and is easily talked out of her villainy. As a huge relief, Bloodwork returns for one episode, remaining Eric Wallace's one and only fantastic villain, including in this episode. The true Reverse Flash returns for one episode, as Matt Letcher is finally allowed to play pre-season 1 Thawne again in a full circle moment, and it's easily Thawne's best appearance in Eric Wallace's era. Unfortunately, literally just 3 episodes later, Thawne returns again, tied for his worst ever appearance, as bad dialogue, over-the-top acting, and a stupid role in the episode. Reverse Flash genuinely sucks in the finale, as does the rest of the Legion of Zoom. For one, that name makes no sense. Why is it named after Zoom? He's one of the members and he's not the leader. Zoom is completely out of character in his dialogue and a butchering of everything that made Zoom great. Savitar is completely wasted and only appears for like 30 seconds. And Godspeed, well, he's always sucked and he sucks here as well. All of the Legion of Zoom are awful, and the fact that they're all defeated so easily by the side villains is not just lame, but insulting to the earlier seasons where these villains gave the main characters grief. Now they're just so easily defeated, some of the most easily defeated villains in the history of the show. It's embarrassing. And then you also have Cobalt Blue, who looks cool with a fantastic suit, but Rick Cosnett's acting in combination with the writing makes him feel like a different character. He takes far too long to develop, isn't given the amount of time needed to be a villain or develop a rivalry with Barry. His motivation, including the promise of a daughter who looks like Nora, is so weird, and there's literally no reason for why he'd be able to compete with Barry in a fight, as his first fight with the Flash is one of the first times he's ever even used his powers. Cobalt Blue is technically a step up from Red Death, but still mostly sucks. I would say Red Death was good in episode 3, and then you have Bloodwork in episode 9 and Reverse Flash in episode 10, so that's 3 episodes out of 13 with good main villains, or even decent main villains like Red Death in episode 3. Everything else sucks. 10 episodes of genuinely awful main villains out of the 13. The Flash has been a show I followed since the beginning, even before if you count Barry, Caitlin, and Cisco's appearances on Arrow, and has been a fundamental part of my YouTube channel from the start. The season, however, doesn't just represent the end of The Flash, but also, after every other show has ended, The Flash Season 9 is a bookending to the Arrowverse, and they knew that going in. The season does bring in Batwoman, Dreamer from Supergirl, and even both Diggle and Green Arrow, with the latter two being a worthy send-off to that show. However, as a whole, while it isn't necessarily this season's responsibility to cap off the Arrowverse, it should have, and we would have been way better off if it had. The season brought in Batwoman in a terrible storyline, Dreamer, who's a character with no connection to anyone from The Flash or unresolved storylines, while Supergirl herself hasn't been seen with The Flash since the Crisis. Legends of Tomorrow ended on a cliffhanger that really could have used a resolution, as did the Green Arrow and the Canaries episode of Arrow. They brought in Mia Queen in Armageddon but didn't resolve it there. They really needed to resolve it here, and I gotta be honest, even though the Arrowverse, and more personally for this show itself, The Flash, is coming to an end, the season never really made me feel anything emotionally speaking for the ending outside of those 2 individual episodes. They had a fantastic opportunity to focus entirely on the ending, on the finality of the season, and instead they focused on the ending of the Arrowverse in 1 episode and focused on the show going full circle in another, and everything else is kind of just random bullshit. It's such a missed opportunity and it's such a shame. There are the occasional moments carried by Grant Gustin and Blake Neely where I felt some sadness or emotional response, but for the final season of not just The Flash, but also the Arrowverse, especially compared to something like Arrow Season 8, those moments were too few and far between, and this is actually one of the less emotional seasons of The Flash, especially compared to the early seasons. In conclusion, Season 9 is an embarrassingly bad final season of a once good show, with the dialogue, pacing, storytelling, season structure, cinematography, CGI, fight scenes, supporting cast, and villains are all mostly bad, with the occasional bright spot. Season 9 definitely has redeeming qualities. I can't help but remember the 2 episodes in a row that are 9s out of 10s, with the second of which being a top 10 episode of the show. But that's it. Those 2 episodes are literally the only thing keeping this season from being the worst ever. If even one of them was only an 8 out of 10, I'd say Season 7 was better, but those episodes absolutely saved this season. Saved it, however, from being literally the worst season. Instead, it stuck with the title of being the second worst, as aside from Grant Gustin's acting, Flash's suit, and the music, nothing is consistently great, but many things are consistently awful. Like the score I gave it in my season's ranking video, I'm giving Season 9 a 4 out of 10.